BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
How to be a Renaissance woman. The untold story of beauty and female creativity by Jill Burke. Episode 1. Although there were many types of femininity in the Renaissance, just as there are now, traditional ideas about women, inherited from misogynistic, classical, medieval and religious texts, were that they were essentially inferior to men in every way. Stereotypes of frivolity and vanity played into that idea. A prime question that arose from all this was, what is a woman? The question was investigated everywhere, from the visual arts to theatre to medicine, with doctors studying how character traits that were understood as feminine, an interest in beauty, deceitfulness, stupidity, among others, were linked to the physicality of the body. The years between about 1400 to 1650 are traditionally seen as Europe's, and especially Italy's, cultural peak. The rise of a new medium, the printed book, allowed information to be exchanged at an unprecedented scope and speed. The advent of naturalism and true-to-life portraiture meant that external appearances came under increasing scrutiny. As a result, the ideal shape of women's bodies underwent a change, from the heavy-hipped, large-bellied, thin-shouldered Gothic ideal to the fleshy hourglass of newly fashionable antique statues. The Venetian painter Titian's archetypal female nude of 1538, Venus of Urbino, is a case in point. Languidly lying on her couch, her maids fossicking in the clothes chest behind her, this Venus gazes at the viewer, one hand shielding her genitals, the other inefficiently grasping a posy of roses that fall onto the suggestive tangle of white sheet below her. Male viewers recorded how they admired Titian's ability to conjure up real, quivering, welcoming flesh. But many Renaissance parents believed that girls were inferior to boys in practically every way. Rather than be educated in schools or as apprentices, girls had to be protected, taught in convents or in the home, and when they were ready to marry, there was the cost of the dowry to think about. So women cared about what they looked like. They had to. The earliest known printed book of beauty tips came out in 1526, a pleasant new work which teaches how to make various perfumed compositions to make every woman beautiful, titled Venusta, a word that literally means Venus-like. The implication is that if you follow the instructions within, you will be as resplendent and alluring as the goddess of beauty and love. Publications like the Venusta are the small siblings of a genre called books of secrets, cheap how-to texts that are as characteristic of Renaissance culture as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet or Machiavelli's The Prince. These books sold in their thousands, all across Europe and beyond. They contained a miscellany of recipes for household medicines, preserving food, becoming pregnant, curing plague and other ailments, plus rather eccentric suggestions like how to make invisible ink or dye your horse green as a practical joke. Giovanni Marinello's The Ornaments of Ladies, published in 1562 in Venice, includes more than 1,400 recipes for the beautification of the face, hair, and body. It investigates women's appearance from the crown of their, ideally, golden-haired heads to the tips of their finely rounded toes, showing its female readers how to amend their many faults to get the model physiques described, as Marinello explains, by ancient and modern poets and painters. These books were not aimed at gentlemen or their wives and daughters, who would hardly be wandering the streets, but at working women who were out selling wares, or female servants shopping in the bustling piazzas. For peasant women, who typically had little money and few opportunities, beauty was one way they could advance their life prospects, by finding a good husband. The first recipe you encounter when you open Marinello's book is for a face ointment used by the Queen of Hungary, but made from snails, goat fat, veal marrow, and other inexpensive ingredients. The second just promises to keep the face beautiful and is a type of moisturizer based largely on animal fats. Several recipes seem to be aimed at particular issues faced by labouring women, remedies to rid the face of sunburn and to make the hands white and soft. There are many recipes for hand and face washes, and even health suggestions like eating nettles to give the face a good colour. The section on hair includes both tips for its removal and instructions on how to make it long, blonde, wavy, and smooth. As well as all these creams, washes, tooth powder and shampoo, there are also remedies for women's ailments. Gynecological in nature, these included substances to help women give birth without danger, for getting pregnant, to tighten the vagina, and to elicit menstruation. The last is most likely a thinly veiled abortifacient, a highly hazardous herbal medicine designed to end a pregnancy. These were taken when women were in desperate straits or forced to abort by men intent on hiding their misdeeds. Women wishing to boost their appearance could even buy hair pieces, as noted sniffily by Canon Pietro Cassola in his discussion of Venetian women's hairstyles in the 1490s. The great part is false hair, and this I know for certain because I saw great quantities of it on poles sold by peasants in the Piazza San Marco. Beyond the market square, inside houses both wealthy and poor, there existed a women's world of beauty, where friends, family, servants, or paid professionals would use their skills to improve each other's looks. Poor women recently arrived in the Italian cities, such as Rome and Venice, specialized in creating beauty cures. Women like Anna Ebrea, Jewish Anna. She was part of the Jewish community in Rome, a community that expanded practically overnight due to the 1492 expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Anna's world as an immigrant in Rome was described in a lively picaresque novel called Andalusian Lozana, by one of these Spanish migrants, Francisco Delicado. The action takes place in Rome between 1513 and 1527, just after Michelangelo had completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and when Raphael was painting his glorious fresco cycles in the Vatican. Lozana is a converted Jewish woman, a conversa, who arrives in Rome without a husband or family to support her. She soon inveigles her way into a household led by a woman from Naples and her children, who made their living by concocting facial preparations with powders, rouges, and creams, plucking eyebrows and beautifying betrothed women, while they prepared treatments of rock candy lotions from the jujube tree and astringents for female parts. Lozana was a maestra, a rather loose term for a woman who specialized in various aspects of maintaining and beautifying women's bodies. She had reportedly lived for a while in the Levant, the Muslim Eastern Mediterranean, and she brought the knowledge of beauty practices she gained there to share with her Roman clientele. This included dressing hair, applying makeup for weddings, plucking eyebrows, removing body hair, and creating and applying bespoke skin treatments. Adult women were kept busy in domestic service, either as servants or through more informal relationships, childcare, laundering, wet nursing, cooking, and various odd jobs, often for extremely low wages, as well as labouring on the land, growing food, and spinning wool for textiles. Others worked in a wide variety of family businesses, sometimes in partnership, sometimes as widows. In the Florentine tax records of 1427, there was a female blacksmith, a grocer, a stationer, a linen manufacturer, a money changer, a furrier, a banker, and an international merchant. Renaissance women were generally as knowledgeable, hard-working, and productive as their male counterparts. But they did all this while wrestling with a culture that constantly denied their abilities. In one popular 16th century text, a physician asks bluntly, "Why are women more imprudent and foolish than men?" Writers like Moderata Fonte fought against these commonplace misogynist tropes and hangovers from medieval times. Her chivalric romance epic, Floridoro, published in an incomplete state in 1581, is testament to the power of an imagination fueled by access to books. It tells the story of two heroic knights, one male and one female. The male protagonist, Floridoro, is remarkable for his delightful appearance. With his comely face, golden hair, and white and vermilion complexion, he very much resembles the ideal female beauties of the era. His female counterpart, Risamante, is also beautiful, but is less closely described. She is too busy fighting. Among other adventures, she kills a fierce serpent, vanquishes a treacherous dragon, and lays siege to a city. Fonte explains that Risamante is an example of what women can do if you educate them and allow them freedom. One fundamental and dominating aspect of what it meant to be a woman at this time was childbearing and child-rearing. Although there was rudimentary, unreliable contraception available, and even more rudimentary abortifacients, many women spent much of their time, from the age of puberty to menopause, pregnant. Having a baby a year throughout your 20s was not unusual. Human remains tell us a lot about the toll of repeated pregnancy and childbirth. Despite her likely nutritious and protein-filled diet, the Duchess of Florence, Eleonora di Toledo, suffered terribly from tooth disease, and when she died at the age of 40, she had only a few teeth left. She had 11 children between 1540 and 1554, 3 of whom died in infancy, and another 4 of whom died before they were 20. As the 16th century wore on, women's biology began to be seen as essentially different to men's, rather than simply inferior. This was a moment when men and women began to reconsider the old justifications for men's superior power, arguing that it was not rooted in the fallibility of women's bodies or intellects. If women weren't essentially, naturally, biologically inferior, but were nonetheless treated as lesser members of society, then change became not only possible, but a moral necessity. How to be a Renaissance Woman by Jill Burke was read by Fenella Woolgar and adapted for radio by Libby Spurrier. The producer was Celia de Wolf, and it was a peer production for BBC Radio 4.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
How to be a Renaissance Woman: The Untold History of Beauty and Female Creativity by Jill Burke. Episode 2. Any history of cosmetics and beauty has to consider the relationship between appearance and identity. Before the 16th century, it was difficult for people to see themselves in their entirety from an exterior viewpoint, in the way that others could. In fact, the full-length mirror could be seen as an archetypal Renaissance innovation just as representative of the period as the printing press, the atlas, or the handgun. In 1507, a patent was given to Antonio and Domenico del Gallo to make mirrors of true crystal glass on the island of Murano, near Venice, a place still famous for its expert glassmakers. Before this, flat mirrors were made of polished metal, or you could have small round ones made of blown glass to hold in the hand. These were generally convex, bulging outwards, and thus distorted the features. The Night Hospitaller and humanist Saba da Castiglione parodied the effect of looking in a convex mirror in his diary. It gives such a magnificent reflection of the natural object that his eyelashes, hair, and the hairs of his head look like the bristle of an old boar or the twigs of a besom, and the teeth resemble those of a Turkish horse, older than mine, which was 50 years old. It was possible for the first time for people to see the entirety of themselves, to see yourself in a clear, flat, full-length mirror as if from the outside, to understand more clearly how they were seen by others, and to evaluate their entire bodies. From the 1500s, mirrors started to become a staple subject of Venetian painters like Giovanni Bellini and Titian. Much of Titian's playing with mirrors involved women looking at themselves while getting dressed, adorning their hair, perhaps applying some kind of salve from a pot. This genre of painting remained popular for a couple of centuries, now grouped under the unpromising title of ladies at their toilet paintings. One of the seismic changes in the history of cosmetics at this time was the increasing engagement of physicians with beauty culture, and the belief that beauty could be manipulated from within. In the health regimens that became popular all over Europe in this period, women and men were urged to spend about half an hour cleansing their heads in the morning to purge the body of what in the Renaissance they called excrements that had built up in the stomach overnight. Developments in medical science saw a new academic interest in cosmetic medicine, an interest that was to reach its peak in the University of Padua Medical School in the second half of the 16th century. There, students received lectures on this subject from some of the most prominent physicians of the day, including Gabriele Falloppio. His discussion of cosmetic health starts with a consideration of how health and beauty are related. External beauty is a sign of the perfect harmony of the interior of the body, with all the humours in balance. Thus, ugliness could be understood as a medical problem. He argued for natural proportion, and was firmly against beauty that was painted on. This was harlotry, he explains. Many women argued that the problems they had being understood as equal weren't because they spent too much time on thinking about appearances, or how they wore their hair, or the money or time they spent on cosmetics. To the contrary, their appearance was one of the few areas where they had some agency. Christine de Pizan was probably the first woman in the 15th century to discuss this issue. She was a Venetian-born physician's daughter and widowed at 25. Facing destitution, she started to make a living for herself as a writer. In 1405, she authored 2 texts that were to become landmarks in the history of feminist thought: The Book of the City of Ladies and The Treasure of the City of Ladies. Her character, Lady Rectitude, answers a question from the author about whether it's fair that women who love wearing pretty clothes and accessories receive a great deal of criticism because people say they do this in order to seduce men. Presaging much feminist criticism since, Rectitude suggests that although being overly interested in one's looks is a flaw, she also wants to make sure that women who look pretty are not excessively criticized. I assure you that not all women do this to seduce men. Some people, both men and women, are just naturally inclined to enjoy elegance and attractive, rich clothing, cleanliness, and the finer things in life. Some female writers argue that it was fitting for women to be interested in beauty because they are naturally more beautiful than men. An important exponent of this argument was Giovanni Marinello's daughter, Lucrezia. She became one of the most famous female writers of the early modern period. She was described during her lifetime as a woman of wondrous eloquence and learning, exceptional in writing prose and poetry, and a marvellous and truly learned woman. She was a testament to the power of women once they were educated. Her most famous work, The Nobility and Excellence of Women and the Defects and Vices of Men, was published in Venice in 1600. This treatise on the superiority of the female sex is deeply erudite, witty, and thoughtful. It's a polemic that not only argues for the superiority of women's intellects, but seeks to prove it in a dazzling display of knowledge, a massive range of references, and through her fluently confident and lucid writing, which repeatedly bashes misogynists on the head with erudition. She cites sources from Plato to Petrarch to Giovanni Ebreo to argue that women's beauty is ultimately derived from the divine. She summarizes, "So, if women are more beautiful than men, who, as can be seen, are generally coarse and ill-formed, who can deny that they are more remarkable? Nobody, in my opinion. Thus it can be said that beauty in a woman is a marvellous spectacle and a miracle worthy of respect, though it is never fully honoured and respected by men." In practice, women's appearance could very much be the choice of men, and was frequently subject to legislation. Sumptuary legislation was common across Europe in this period. These laws restricted certain items of clothing to certain groups, with governments seeking to maintain social order and morals. This legislation often sought to prevent women from spending too much on clothing or jewellery, and ensured that they weren't wearing clothes that fell foul of propriety, masculine haircuts or overly revealing clothing, for example. In the Renaissance, as now, women were most prominently on display when they were getting married, and they were expected to wear the wealth of their lineage on their backs. Once married, beauty remained important, as it was a wife's job to stop a husband from straying. Giovanni Marinello's book Ornaments is peppered with grave warnings to wives who don't keep up appearances for their existing spouses. "What is more displeasing to a husband than a wife whose nose is always running?" he asks at one point. At another he notes, "It is an indecent thing for a lady who sleeps at the side of her husband if, whilst sleeping, saliva or spit dribbles from her mouth, because, as well as being derived from some defect of the stomach or the brain, because of this disgusting thing he can start to hate her." Essentially, women who didn't maintain their looks were pushing their husbands into adultery. Scholarship on Renaissance England has shown the relationship between women's skin whitening practices and the English state's colonial expansion. White skin and golden blonde hair were associated with feminine delicacy. Fetishizing such qualities was just one of many ways to justify the brutal and dehumanizing treatment of darker-skinned women. It was normal for well-to-do Italian households of this era to own female slaves. From classical times and throughout the Middle Ages, girls and young women were snatched from their homes in Crimea, Russia, and the area around the Black Sea, then traded in slave markets in Genoa and Venice. By the mid-16th century, European port cities, especially in the Iberian Peninsula and Italy, included a high proportion of inhabitants from sub-Saharan Africa. As many as 1 in 10 of the population in major trading cities such as Seville, Venice, Antwerp, Livorno and Naples were black. As the skin colour of slaves got darker, the demands on the ladies of the house to have whiter skin intensified. Skin whitening was the goal of many European cosmetic recipes during the Middle Ages, but the recipes grow in number and complexity during the 16th century. Marinello's Ornaments, for example, has a chapter on ways to make the face, the neck, the chest, the hands and every other part of the body white like alabaster, that contains no fewer than 74 recipes, running the full gamut of ingredients from the traditional white lead ceruse to pastes made from marble, wheat, and bryony. Young black women, aged between 18 and 25, were the most expensive category of slaves at this time, and beauty was one of the criteria used to price them. Once bought, slaves were often branded on the face, sometimes with the full name of their master, so they could be easily recognized if they ran away. These women acted as skivvies in wealthy households, as sexual playthings for the men of the family, and if they got pregnant, could be hired out as wet nurses. This is the era when sculptures of the Black Venus start to appear in some quantity. They typically exploited the colours of materials like ebony, bronze, and semi-precious stones to evoke smooth, glowing brown and black skin. Black women's beauty is also explored in Italian poetry of the period, though in the context where immigrant women tended to be stripped of agency, the inherent power dynamics in these verses can be disturbing. A poem by Giovan Battista Marino on his beautiful slave, published in 1604, shows how his desire was entangled with Renaissance racist hierarchies. Black, yes, but you are beautiful, or by nature amongst the beauties of Eros, a comely monster. You are as dusky as dawn, which dwindles and darkens compared to your ebony, ivory, and scarlet. While poor white women could sometimes find wealth and agency through their attractiveness to wealthier men, even this uncertain path was difficult to follow for people whose faces and bodies were deemed simply too far from the white-skinned, golden-haired ideal. How to Be a Renaissance Woman by Jill Burke was read by Fenella Woolgar and adapted for radio by Libby Spurrier. The producer was Celia de Wolf, and it was a peer production for BBC Radio 4.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
How to Be a Renaissance Woman, The Untold Story of Beauty and Female Creativity by Jill Burke. Episode 3. In 1499, Isabella d'Este apologised to the Duke of Milan for looking too fat in the portrait she'd sent him. "It's not a good likeness, as it's a bit fatter than I am," she anxiously explained. The Duke replied, rather ungallantly, that the likeness seemed very good. "It is true that it makes you look somewhat fatter than your ladyship seemed the last time he saw her, although perhaps you have grown fatter since?" Most famous now for her extraordinary art patronage and political acuity, Isabella struggled with her weight for years. As early as 1492, when she was just 18, she asked her sister-in-law, Elisabetta Gonzaga, not to send her figs again, as she was eating to get thinner rather than on a fattening diet. Isabella was still dieting a decade later. In June 1509, she told her husband off for sending her a gift of partridges, which, like countless boxes of chocolates given today as testaments to marital love, ran the risk of scuppering her slimming diet. In fact, she testedly explains in her letter, if she'd been trusted more to deal with political matters, she probably wouldn't have got so fat. Male rulers, too, could be anxious about piling on the pounds. In 1476, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan, refused to put on his protective underarmour before going to the cathedral for a church service because it made him look too fat. Better fat than dead, however, as he was to find out later that day when he was assassinated by stabbing with knives that easily pierced his doublet and shirt. The earliest printed book aimed specifically at helping people keep weight off and advice on how to put it on was published in 1481. This treatise about the conservation of health, with a book about keeping the body healthy, was aimed at male readers and had been around in manuscript form for about 50 years. It was attributed to the physician to the Ferrarese court, Ugo Benzi. Much of the second half of this short volume is dedicated to conserve and defend a healthy body with regular and measured habits, with tips and suggestions to gain weight, and also so that one does not get too fat over the passage of time. For women also, a little fatness was thought to be a good thing, and in fact, fat was often a complimentary term. In a letter of 1543, for example, the 21-year-old Eleonora di Toledo, the Duchess of Florence, is reported to be bursting with health after the birth of her second child. Fat and fresh like a rose. I have never seen a better complexion on a woman. Like everything in Renaissance medicine, however, balance was the key. Perhaps the new concern with fatness may also relate to a change in diet. The later 15th century saw the cost of sugar plummet. The richer you were, the more sugar you were likely to eat. Sugar sculpture started to become increasingly common at banquets in the 15th century, perhaps reaching a peak in 1513, when the Florentine apothecary Luca Landucci reports the Portuguese king gave Pope Leo X a pope and 12 cardinals made of sugar, all life-size, as well as 300 sugar torches, each a yard long, 100 chests full of sugar, and chests of spices. A Paduan physician called Santorio was interested in finding out what the body did with food, so he created a weighing machine that could accommodate an entire person. He said he weighed hundreds of people on his machine, plus the weight of all the food and drink they ate, and the weight of their urine and feces, thus proving that the body somehow used up some of what it consumed. For most people, however, the measure for fatness, taken from antique sources, was simply related to whether it hampered your life in one way or another. For instance, when a man cannot wipe his own bottom without effort, or when he gets too tired to walk about, or when he's prevented, by fatness, in bending over to hold his ankles, Ugo Benzi explains in his 1481 manual. Probably the most famous Renaissance diet book was Alvise Cornaro's Short Compendium for a Sober Life. First published in 1558, this book has been more or less consistently in print since. Cornaro recommended that the reader eat progressively less food as they age, moderate the amount of wine they drink, and only eat as much as the stomach can easily digest. It was believed that thinness was caused by overly dry humours. Thus, for Giovanni Marinello, the air of a thin lady's chamber should be made humid and sweet-smelling. She should walk slowly, eat special foods, have much youth-bringing rest, and above all, avoid melancholy and anger. Being happy was very important for putting on weight. The food recommended was itself happy-making, involving almonds, sesame seeds and honey, or sweetened and fortified milk. Getting thinner was, mainly, less fun. It involved making the body's humours hotter and drier. In his lecture On Decoration, Gabriele Falloppio advised men diagnosed with unnatural obesity to sit in the hot sun, naked, to dry the body out. They should also have hot baths, do exercise such as horse riding, stay up at night studying, sleep on a hard board, and have little food but lots of sex. Frequenting spas could also help, according to some. Women's exercise could be a controversial topic. It may have been difficult for aristocratic women to move around much, as it was deemed more suitable for them to spend much of their time indoors. Some, such as Isabella de' Medici and her sisters in Florence, rode horses from early childhood and went hunting along with their male peers, but this does not seem to have been the norm. By the end of the 16th century, sedan chairs had become a popular way for rich women to move around cities in Italy, an innovation that was frequently blamed for its ill effects on health. By the end of the 16th century, walking was agreed by most authorities to be the best exercise. Streets were paved, and parks and villa gardens were designed with long avenues to enhance promenading. In inclement weather, if you were wealthy enough, you could even walk inside, as long galleries, normally lined with paintings of landscapes or still lives of plants and animals, were created in the houses of the aristocracy for them to stroll through. It seems that, in the Renaissance, as now, people would go to elaborate lengths to alter the shape of their bodies to meet the ideal. New technologies invented from the 15th through to the 17th century meant that Renaissance bodies could be changed through more drastic means. In the summer of 2008, archaeologists started to investigate Lengberg Castle in the East Tyrol in Austria. In a vault stuffed with various types of material, twigs, straw, old pieces of wood, shoes, and more than 2,700 fragments of textiles, they discovered 4 women's bras. These are the oldest bras in existence, and came as quite a surprise to most clothing historians, as the bra was meant to have been invented around 400 years later. The Lengberg bras were designed to lift and separate, and to invisibly support. Many a woman makes 2 bags for the breast, claims an anonymous satirical poem written in southern Germany in the 15th century. And with them she roams the streets so that all the men look at her and see what beautiful breasts she has. Fashions changed soon after, and the monobosom, one smooth curve over the chest, became more popular. Artemisia Gentileschi is the most enduringly well-known and influential of the many female painters of early modern Italy. In her self-portrait as a lute player, she presents the viewer with her own heaving bosoms bursting out of her low-cut neckline. Artemisia's first layer would have been the white linen undershirt peeking out below her blue dress. Above this, there is a blue bodice, and it's this garment that provides the support that pushes up the breasts. As well as flattening or supporting the breasts, the bodice also shaped the abdomen. These were thought by some to be dangerous. The French philosopher Michel de Montaigne exclaimed of his female contemporaries in 1588, "To get a slim body, Spanish style, what torture do they not endure, tight-laced and braced until they suffer great gashes in their sides, right to the live flesh. Yes, sometimes even they die of it." Nose reconstruction surgery originates in 15th century Sicily, when the Branca family of surgeons became famous for their work in reconstructing not just noses, but also ears and lips. In 1590, a young Swiss woman, known only as Susanna N., was attacked by a group of soldiers. She fought against their attempts to rape her, and they cut off her nose in retribution. 2 years later, the French surgeon, Jean Griffon, successfully reconstructed her nose by employing new techniques that were first developed in southern Italy, using skin from her upper arm. Reports from 1611 and 1613 say that her new nose, beyond going slightly blue in very cold weather, was still looking good. Even more drastic measures were introduced in 1597, when the Bolognese surgeon Gaspare Tagliacozzi published his groundbreaking book, Surgery for Mutilations. There he describes how a flap of skin would be cut from the back of the upper arm and, while still attached to the arm, could be grafted to the face in place of the missing nose. He designed special equipment in order to keep the patient's head and arm in the correct position for the requisite 3 weeks. It was common for noses to be the target of mob retribution and honour-based duels. Not everyone was suitable for this type of surgery, though. Due to the pain and physical exertion it involved, Tagliacozzi recommends 2 strong men to hold the patient down. The procedure was recommended only for young, strong people. Others would have to make do with a prosthetic nose. These could be made of wax, ivory, or even metals such as silver, which were tied onto the face with ribbon. Demand for body modification was pushing science towards creative and boundary-breaking solutions. How to Be a Renaissance Woman by Jill Burke was read by Fenella Woolgar and adapted for radio by Libby Spurrier. The producer was Celia de Wolf, and it was a peer production for BBC Radio 4.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
How to Be a Renaissance Woman, The Untold Story of Beauty and Female Creativity by Jill Burke. Episode 4. Of all the female writers from this period, Arcangela Tarabotti is the most bracingly furious. Her book, Paternal Tyranny, vibrates with rage against a system where women had few choices over their lives. She argues that gender equality is fundamental to true faith, and that Christ treated women as equals of men. Tarabotti was forced by her father to enter a convent as a child of 11, and took her final vows at 16, an experience that around 1 in 8 women went through in Italy in the later 16th and 17th centuries, as the number of nuns rocketed due to the spiralling costs of dowries. Novitiate nuns had their hair shaved off to mark the transition to their new life, and covered their heads with a veil. Once they had entered the convent, they were supposed to shave their heads at least once a month during the winter, and every 2 weeks in the summer. For Tarabotti, this ritual process exemplified everything that was wrong with a patriarchal society. Women's hair is a sign of both liberty and superiority, and since she is free and not subject, she should not allow her head to be shorn. How can it be right for women to crop their own hair, thereby removing from themselves the greatest attraction and adornment received from nature? In a later book, Convent Paradise, she explains how she retained her interior liberty. I cut my hair, but I did not uproot my feelings. In the Renaissance, care of the head and hair was central to health regimens. The regimen Sanitatis Salerni, based on an original Arabic text, but in the Middle Ages ascribed to Arnaldus de Villanova, was a remarkable popular health manual. This treatise opens with advice on 6 non-negotiable things to do after waking up in the morning to preserve your health. Besides washing your eyes and hands, moving about, stretching, and brushing your teeth, he goes on, the 5th thing you must do is comb your hair. It opens the pores on the head and allows vapours that are left in the brain after sleep to escape and makes the spirit sharper. Therefore it is necessary that the comb be used several times every day because it draws vapours out of the top of the body and moves them away from the eyes. Women also use their hairstyles to signify loyalty and belonging, or political allegiance. Eleonora of Aragon imported the Aragonese look to northern Italy when she married Ercole d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, in 1473. This consisted of a long hairpiece plait called a coazzone down the back, with a cap on the back of the head held in place by a band that went round the forehead. Eleonora's daughter, Isabella d'Este, was equally famous for the avant-garde hairstyles that she invented. There's a gossipy letter in 1505 that suggests her outrage when she heard that Lucrezia Borgia and her female entourage had stolen Isabella's look. For women with a limited degree of agency, hair provided a means of shared creative expression. Even for those like Tarabotti, who were forced to conform to social strictures, the idea of hair could inspire rebellion. "I reformed my life," she says in Convent Paradise, "but my thoughts, like my hair, the more they are cut, the more they grow, continually multiplying." Cultural and religious conventions that encourage depilation have long existed in Islamic cultures. Here, removal of hair in public baths was standard practice. Perhaps the earliest first-person account of this is by Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian Arab who tells the story of a bathhouse attendant who had his loincloth torn off by a Frankish knight. Upon seeing his shaved pubic area, the knight demanded that he should have his own body hair shaved off and asked that the attendant do the same for his wife. Recipes for hair removal start to proliferate as the 16th century goes on, first starting in manuscript texts and later disseminated in print from around the 1550s, suggesting that elite women were initially more concerned with removing their body hair than their lower status peers. In an anonymous manuscript of around 1500, known as the Ricettario Galante, there is a whole section described as a treatise on removing hair from the body in diverse ways so it never returns. There are no fewer than 16 recipes for hair removal, ranging from variations on the traditional quicklime arsenic combination to more esoteric recipes made up of ingredients including ivy, ant eggs, and hedgehogs. As much of the population could not afford a visit to a university-trained physician or learned apothecary, they turned to wise women who might diagnose illnesses and sell healing potions, sometimes alongside magic charms and cosmetic waters. An archetypal example is a woman known only as Maddalena the Weaver, who was put on trial in Rome in 1613 for manufacturing poison. Maddalena also offered love magic to clients, rented out rooms to sex workers, and, she explained, "I make waters for washing women's faces, and I also make oils from herbs of all kinds." In 1485, in the northern city of Como, there was a witch trial where 41 sorceresses were burnt to ashes after the hair was shaven off over their entire bodies. This event is recorded approvingly in the important Witchfinder's Handbook, The Hammer of Witches, Malleus Maleficarum, published 2 years later, written by 2 Dominican friars. It recommends complete removal of suspects' body hair, as in the case in Como. For the sorcery of silence, witches sometimes keep superstitious amulets consisting of certain objects in their clothing or in the hair of the body, or sometimes in the most secret places, which cannot be named. There is evidence that women, especially poorer women, did sometimes use charms to secure a marriage proposal. There was a rash of trials in Modena in the 1590s, for example, where women used charmed nutmeg, candles, and religious apparatus to secure a good match. High-status women might also resort to similar methods in matters of love. A gossipy letter of 1578 about Queen Margaret de Valois' attempts to conquer the heart of her husband, King Henry IV of France, revealed that she had been locked in her bathroom with her maids for 3 days, always in the water, white as a lily, smelling like balsam, rubbing and re-rubbing herself, using incense in a way so that you might think that she is like a witch with her spells. A poorer, less noble woman might well have been accused of witchcraft for much less than this. Many of the types of potions and lotions women used to beautify themselves were supposedly also used in magic. A Milanese witchcraft manual of 1608 argues that witches may poison a victim by anointing him with their lotions, waters, oils, and unguents. They anoint the thighs, or belly, or head, throat, breast, ribs, or some other part of the body. Recipes often contain animal ingredients that to a modern eye seem decidedly witchy. Newts, doves, bats, frogs, chickens that have eaten snakes. For skin conditions, he even recommends the blood of a child, or 3 litres of blood of healthy red-headed men no older than 25 or 30. In 1659, a woman named Marta Buzzicoli confessed to her local priest that she was thinking about killing her husband. 2 friends of hers had managed to get hold of some poison and had successfully murdered their husbands without being detected. The priest went to the authorities, who offered Marta immunity in return for information. Using undercover detectives and a sting operation, the police managed to capture 5 women. They were all accused of selling poison to a group of female acquaintances over the previous 5 or so years, a successful business that was convincingly linked to the murder of 46 husbands. The Mantuan ambassador speculated as many as 500 men were finished off by their wives, their deaths unnoticed in the wake of the recent plague. The extraordinary stories of these ordinary women highlight the reality of the daily lives of people who normally don't make the history books. The whole thing started, according to evidence from one of the poison suppliers, Graziosa Farina, because women often got together to chat about their marriages. As we women normally do, my companion started to talk to me about what women go through with their husbands and how their men disgust them. And I told her that I also had a wayward husband, and that I had undergone many woes, and that he had reduced me to misery. These women reveal the amount of violence women had to put up with, not just from their husbands, but from their fathers, brothers, sons-in-law. Women of this kind often show up in the criminal archives, either widowed or simply abandoned by their husbands, often with children in tow. They were poor and skirted on the edge of destitution. They worked as laundresses, sellers of secrets, cosmetics, love charms, magic, or as procurers for younger women. The woman at the centre of the poisoning network was Giovanna de Grandis. Her main income was as a cavamacchia, someone who removed stains from clothes. Giovanna was friends with a Sicilian widow called Girolama Spanna, who had learnt the recipes for the poison from her stepmother. These women were able to attain the poisons by pretending they were using them for cosmetic purposes. Arsenic was just one of several toxic ingredients found in Renaissance skincare. Giovanna originally bought the arsenic via a friend's husband, explaining to him that they needed it to make acquabella to beautify their complexions. When the authorities seized another woman who had bought a bottle of the poison from Giovanna, she feigned ignorance. "The liquid is meant to remove blemishes from the complexion. That's what the woman who gave it to me said." But the game was up, and in July 1659, 5 of the women were hanged on the Campo dei Fiori. A 6th woman fled to Naples and was hanged there the following year. Renaissance women have too long been mocked by posterity for their use of poisonous cosmetics. But their relationship to these toxic substances should be understood in the context of their often desperate social circumstances and the intolerable lives that many of them had to suffer. How to Be a Renaissance Woman by Jill Burke was read by Fenella Woolgar and adapted for radio by Libby Spurrier. The producer was Celia de Wolf, and it was a peer production for BBC Radio 4.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
How to Be a Renaissance Woman. The Untold Story of Beauty and Female Creativity by Jill Burke. Episode 5. Recent research has revealed an astonishing amount of scientific knowledge inherent in medical and cosmetic remedy texts written by Renaissance women or based on their recipes. Not just knowledge about the properties of ingredients, what plants, minerals, animal products are efficacious, but about chemical processes as well. In his introduction to the standard 16th century textbook on European medical materials, Pietro Andrea Mattioli notes that there have been some generous women who, to gain fame and immortal glory, have marvellously delighted in knowledge of the virtues of plants. Women retained their importance as midwives, healers, and nurses. It was women who investigated and either made or bought medicines. Beyond their domestic kitchens and small-scale businesses, some women were able to make a living in more formal settings. 5 of the 85 apothecaries registered in Venice in 1569 were women, running businesses in their own right. Renaissance apothecary shops were a sight to behold, displaying hundreds of custom-made maiolica or stoneware jars, glass flasks, seemingly countless wooden drawers of exotic ingredients, and shelves stuffed full of sugar and spices. All that variety, all those ingredients from around the world, and all that possibility neatly organized in easy-to-find rows. Apothecary shops were much more than mere chemists. They sold a vast number of ingredients and pre-made cures, gave healthcare advice, and often had on-site physicians who would diagnose the underlying humoral imbalance that caused the customer's ailments. In Florence at the turn of the 17th century, there were 23 women enrolled in the Physicians' and Apothecaries' Guild. Nuns were particularly important in running apothecaries as businesses to fund their convents. In Rome in 1695, no fewer than 34 pharmacies were overseen by nuns. These were organised along the same lines as the traditional shops governed by the guilds. One nun would be the master apothecary, and she would be aided by apprentices from the convent. For example, Giovanna Ginori, a daughter of a prominent Florentine family, entered the Dominican convent of Santa Caterina da Siena when she was 12. Giovanna was placed as an apprentice in the convent pharmacy for 6 years and showed real aptitude for the job. She went on to run the pharmacy for the next 37 years, becoming well known across the city for being extremely knowledgeable about medicals and botanicals. Many women were informal experts in pharmacy, but one 16th century woman stands out, not just for having her thoughts on a range of scientific matters put into print, but also for her prescient words about the human impact on the natural balance of the world. Camilla Erculiani, the daughter of a grocer, was born around 1540 and worked, along with her husband, at the 3 Stars Pharmacy near the University of Padua. She published her Letters on Natural Philosophy in 1584. She was one of the few Italian women in this period to publish on scientific subjects. This is particularly impressive given that Erculiani had to juggle her scientific investigations with her duties as a wife and mother. She complains of the toil of raising children, the burden of running a household, the obedience I owe to my husband, and my weak humoral constitution. Her book consists of essays in the form of letters, where she considers, according to the frontispiece, the natural cause of Noah's flood, the natural temperament of mankind, and the natural formation of the rainbow. Erculiani was the first person to suggest that rather than being solely the will of God, the biblical flood could instead be explained by natural, what we'd call environmental, means. She linked it to the essential sinfulness of humanity. Erculiani's views were to make her a target of the increasingly suspicious Counter-Reformation Church. She was arrested and interrogated by the Inquisition around 1585. Although she was probably released without charge, the documentation is not clear, this is the last we hear of her. 3 other women stand out from this period. Sophonisba Anguissola was born in 1535 and painted more self-portraits than almost any other Renaissance artist. This is a woman with a marked capacity for mischief. Her most famous painting is a portrait of 2 of her sisters playing chess, while an older maid looks on. The youngest sister, Europa, also peeking at the game, grins with joyful schadenfreude as the middle sister is checkmated. By her early 20s, Sophonisba had become something of an international sensation. She was renowned for being particularly beautiful, but she was one of the few women in the 16th century who had significant control over her own image. Remarkably for the time, and despite a large number of suitors, she remained unmarried until she was in her late 30s, when the Spanish king presented her with a selection of suitable Italian men to choose from. She chose Fabrizio Moncada, the governor of the small town of Paternò in Sicily. Tragically, 5 years later, he drowned. The year afterwards, now in her mid-40s, Sophonisba decided to return to Cremona and fell in love with the captain of the boat she was travelling on. Despite objections from her family and from the Duke of Florence, largely because of the potential groom's inferior social status, she married him anyway. In 1624, the up-and-coming 25-year-old painter Antony van Dyck sought out Sophonisba at home in Palermo. He recorded his impressions of the 92-year-old artist while he was drawing her, and his warm admiration shines through. She still has her memory and a very sharp mind. She is most courteous, and even if she is losing her sight due to her age, she nonetheless put the paintings in front of her with great enthusiasm, and with great effort put her nose on them so she could discern them a little, and she took great pleasure in this. Actresses, singers, and courtesans, and sometimes women were all 3, used their voice, both for speaking and for singing, to make their way in a world where women's silence was often equated with chastity, loquaciousness with sexual promiscuity. An eloquent woman is never chaste, was a popular 15th century saying. Vincenza Armani was one of the first female professional actors and was extremely famous during her lifetime. She has placed the art of acting on a par with that of oratory, proclaimed a male critic, and partly with her marvellous beauty, partly with her indescribable grace, she has built a great monument to herself, with the world as her audience, revealing herself to be the most excellent actress of our age. The only surviving script that we know for certain Armani delivered is titled Prologue for Madame Vincenza, Actress, recited by her in men's clothing. It is a humorous speech on the importance of silence, designed to be given at the beginning of a play to persuade the audience to keep quiet during the performance. This androgynous figure promised a reward for those audience members who did what they were told. Those who are silent will find my eyes, my mouth, my tongue, and my body more willing to give them pleasure. Armani's life was full of intrigue, but she was silenced all too soon. murdered by poison at the age of 39. If a beautiful appearance could charm the body through the eyes, a melodious voice speaking or singing was just as dangerous to the unwary male. The extraordinary control required to deliver the ornate tremolo and agile trills that Baroque composers demanded of their female singers astonished and titillated contemporary audiences. One of these composers was Barbara Strozzi. Strozzi was the illegitimate daughter of a female servant, Isabella Garzoni, and, it is thought, her master, the writer Giulio. Her father's involvement with artistic and literary academies was decisive for the young Barbara's career. It seems that Giulio appointed her a music teacher, Francesco Cavelli, who encouraged her onto the public stage. Strozzi never married, but from at least 1640 she was in a long-term relationship with one of her father's friends. She went on to have 4 children, possibly his, though all of them were registered as illegitimate. Despite her own success, both her daughters became nuns, rather than following Strozzi into a secular musical career or marriage. This must have been with her blessing and encouragement as head of the family, and that's perhaps an indication of the burden that being a successful creative woman could create. The Venetian courtesan, Veronica Franco, was a sex worker. Her name first appears, along those of many other teenage girls, in a 1565 catalogue of all the principal and most honoured courtesans of Venice. She was hired out to men by her mother, also a prostitute, for 2 scudi. This seems to have been a familiar story for many poor women in Renaissance Venice, but Franco became renowned for her charm and eloquence in Venetian salon culture. She wrote several poems, and in 1580 published a letter collection that included missives to many key political figures, including King Henry III of France, who was her client when he visited Venice. Franco's unusual daring in expressing her own sexual desire led to her being incredibly successful in her heyday. She became a tourist attraction in her own right for visitors to the city. Hers is an extraordinary, transgressive voice in a period where the pressures for women to conform to modes of sexual probity were very strong and penalties severe. Her writings sum up the impossible contradictions inherent in femininity in the Renaissance period. What we do with our hair, face, and body reflects and affects our social world. Creating path-breaking work as a Renaissance woman meant engaging with your own appearance. Maintaining a beautiful mask tended to be essential for women's careers, and it came at a significant psychological and physical cost, especially for women with no family resources. The decisions we make about the most seemingly intimate parts of our lives are bound to bigger social and political forces. How to Be a Renaissance Woman by Jill Burke was read by Fenella Woolgar and adapted for radio by Libby Spurrier. The producer was Celia de Wolf, and it was a peer production for BBC Radio 4.